welcome to a short discussion about some of the political factors that we've been seeing inside the Russian state recently. I want to talk about specifically two trends that we're not going to look at in too much depth, but I want to begin discussing them. So we're talking about, for one thing, the importance of personal and clan connections, and on the other hand, the importance of formalization within the state. And specifically, I want to look at how these factors affect the positions and actions of some of the key players that we're looking at who have been publicly troublesome recently and in states of conflict. Now, specifically, I'm talking about Prigozhin and Shoigu. Now, the first time that I heard predictions that Shoigu was about to be fired was about, I think, a week or two into the war. And people have still been bringing this up occasionally, although it's gotten less popular as a topic of discussion, I'd say, over the last 6-7 months. Now, Shoigu isn't going to get fired. Let's start with that. That's a pretty bold claim to make, considering how badly he has messed things up and how poorly the army under his jurisdiction is doing. But I think it's reasonable to make, particularly considering that it's been going badly for over a year now, and he is still in his post. But let's break that down. Shoigu is not going to be fired. Why? And the main reason is personal connections and clan loyalty. Shoigu is Putin's hunting buddy. They have been friendly and close for 20 years. Shoigu headed the Unity Party in the 2000 election, which was essential, or if not essential, then highly beneficial to Putin's political ascent. So there is a history there of personal loyalty and connection, and that is really the most important thing inside the current state. I remember reading a quote, which I have not been able to find to my great frustration, from a regime insider, which I believe was in Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, which went along the lines of, in the Putin state, people do not get fired for incompetence, they get fired for disloyalty. And this highlights two very important things that keep Shoigu fairly safe. First of all, he is close with Putin. He has a connection to Putin. He sees Putin and talks to Putin and has Putin's ear to some degree. This is one of the most important things in the current political structure. People have been very cautious and have made poor decisions because they were afraid of losing access to Putin. People have said openly that they have chosen to lie to him or to not voice objections because they thought that would mean seeing him less, and why would they want to shoot themselves in the foot? So he has this. This is very important. He also has formal power inside a major institution of force, the military. This is incredibly important because right now things are stable, but at some point in time when things are not stable, potentially post-Putin, if he dies, one of the most important factors in determining who will take over is who has access to the most hard power. And Shoigu, considering also, and going back to connections, he has connections to other people. He is forming one solid lobby with Valery Gerasimov currently, and this has been helped along by Prigozhin, who has kind of shoved them closer together, as opposed to his preferred MOD leadership figure, which is Surovikin. So we've seen Shoigu and Gerasimov kind of forced together, and they are, as far as we can tell, on good terms. These are the two ranking figures in the military aside from Putin. So if something does happen to Putin, Shoigu will be well placed to succeed in the new Russia. So Shoigu has personal connections, and he has institutional authority in the most important places. Now, you could also have somebody who has these personal and clan connections, but does not have institutional authority. This is somebody like Yuri Kovalchuk, who is very close with Putin, who has been a huge influence on Putin, ideologically, politically, personally. They are friends. During the pandemic, when Putin was in lockdown, he spent a lot of time with Kovalchuk, and that highly influenced the new, more ideological and distinct way that we have seen Putin's belief in Russia as a nation and in the Russian Empire manifest that was not necessarily there before the pandemic and certainly was not there to the same extent. So Kovalchuk is very influential, but he does not have a formal position. That said, he does also have clan connections. He has a whole bunch of connections to people in business and in the top levels of the administration. He is well connected, he has friends, and he is relatively well placed as long as Putin is alive and those friends are in place. If something happened to Putin, he would have to depend very heavily on these people, on these connections within the state that are less high ranking but nonetheless very important. Personal loyalties, though, are vulnerable and insecure and often impermanent. So somebody like Kovalchuk might look towards some sort of formalization of his position within the state. So there were rumors going around a while back that Kovalchuk might be looking for and might get a seat on the Security Council, which would be a formalization of his already current position as almost an advisor to Putin on matters of national security and policy. But he does not hold any official position currently because he is in business and his only real influence is as a business connection. I believe he's been described as was a regime banker. He's also a friend of Putin's. Those are his influences, but he does not have a formal position. Now, somebody like Yevgeniy Prigozhin, he has a personal connection. He has a personal connection to Putin, and that is why he still has Wagner, and it makes him very important and very powerful. But it's also all he's got. He's got Putin as his roof, and that protects him from the vendettas of the people in the Ministry of Defense, in the security services, and other people who he's made an enemy of, including many. The term usually used is liberals. It's not entirely accurate because by our standards they wouldn't be liberals. But by the technocrats within the regime. They do not like him, the military does not like him, the security services do not like him. Putin keeps him in his position, keeps him holding some measure of military power. And he really doesn't have anything else. His hard power is there, he has Wagner, but they are heavily, heavily depleted by operations in Ukraine. Many of them are abroad in Syria, in Africa, and in Ukraine. And he is not well liked within the structures of the state. He has made a lot of enemies. He has very actively and proactively pursued making an enemy of Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, who have been very important, and we've seen Putin rebalancing things in favor of Gerasimov and Shoigu. So Prigozhin is not in a great spot here. He also has no formal position within the state. If Putin were to vanish, he would be in deep trouble. He would not be in a good place. So he is extremely vulnerable. And one of the things that he's looking for with his big push in Bakhmut and his attempts to establish himself as a significant figure, he wants a formalization of his authority. He wants some position within the state that will endure beyond Putin if something were to happen, and will endure beyond Putin's temporary favors, because right now, if Shoigu and Gerasimov fell out of favor and somebody like Prigozhin was ascendant, then a new general was put in charge of the military operation, Surovikin is appointed, and Shoigu and Gerasimov continue to be involved at a diminished role. If Prigozhin fell completely out of favor and somebody like Shoigu and Gerasimov was ascendant, then we see Wagner cut off from ammunition. We see reports of, now this is unconfirmed to be clear, roads that Wagner is going down being mined by Russian forces. We see all sorts of infighting, and the military can cut off his logistics networks. They can cut off his transportation. He is so very vulnerable, and he is protected by having Putin's favor right now, to a degree. And right now, Valery Gerasimov and Sergei Shoigu are ascendant. That could change. But if Putin ever decides that he doesn't want Prigozhin around anymore, then Prigozhin is not safe. If Putin decides he doesn't really care for Prigozhin anymore, and he isn't concerned with what happens to him, Prigozhin is again unsafe. He is deeply vulnerable. He cannot secure himself while he is outside of the regime, while also being loathed by those within it. And one thing that I do want to address again with Prigozhin, when we're looking at Wagner, yes, they are significant, yes, they are a major player in the Russian war effort, and they are impressive militarily. They have equipment, they have artillery, supposedly they have planes, they have a lot of people, but they are not capable of fighting as an independent faction to the degree that some people seem to think that they could. they could not relocate to Moscow and stage a coup against Putin on their own. They are heavily dependent on the military, as we have seen with Prigozhin's complaints. They are heavily dependent on the military for logistics, ammunition, supplies, transportation. If the military cut them off, Wagner would be much reduced in capacity. There are also, of course, large sections of other factions in Moscow that would be positioned to prevent such a coup. So you have the FSB, you have Rosgvardia, you have units of the main military. So even if Putin had the forces required to take over the Kremlin and kill off the heads of the government, and even if he could get that army there, he would face serious resistance from other groups that would be almost certainly crushing, and he would thus have to get the acquiescence, if not cooperation, of many groups who don't like him very much. Because Prigozhin is not particularly popular with the FSB. He's very much unpopular with the military right now, with the military leadership. So he does not have a lot of friends. One might even say that he has really no friends within the upper ranks of the state except Putin. He is not well positioned right now. He is a significant player, but he is also arguably the most vulnerable of the major players in the country. So Prigozhin here has two plays. He can either build personal and clan loyalties within the state. He could try to connect himself and ingratiate himself with people like Shoigu and Gerasimov and lower-ranking generals, with the technocrats, with high-ranking figures in the FSB. But he's already burned that bridge. That train has sailed. He can no longer simply make connections with the people he's already alienated. And I think he's burned too many bridges to really have much success with that, outside of potentially some degree in business. Maybe he could do something there, but the business elites are really not that significant. They would not be a useful power base for somebody trying to compete at the top levels of Russian politics, the same way that somebody in the security services would be. So you need to pick valuable, strong allies, and Prigozhin has already alienated most of those potential allies. So he's in a very bad spot. So his alternative to stabilize his position is formalization. He could seek perhaps a seat on the Security Council or some position in the Defense Ministry at a high rank. And I think right now the most plausible is something on the Security Council. Is he going to get that? Probably not. I think if he was going to get that, he would have gotten it after Bakhmut. It's possible that he will at some point in the future, but right now I don't think he's in a good place. He was very aggressive during the last days of the battle in Bakhmut when he thought that they were in serious danger of losing it. And he still talks about that a little bit. It's very difficult to tell exactly how much of what he says about the strategic situation is authentic, but it should all be taken with suspicion because it is very strongly politically motivated. So he has been making no friends, and he's also revealed himself to be unstable and unreliable. During the last few days of Bakhmut, he was shouting about how he was going to leave. He was making strong statements that could have been interpreted and were probably meant to be interpreted in the vaguest plausible deniability way that he could make them as criticisms of Putin. There was a report by Medusa that high-ranking media people were told that if he continued his aggressive criticisms of the government and the Ministry of Defense, they should begin to frame him as a traitor to the Russian Federation and to the Russian state. So he is in an extremely weak position. He has been shored up very heavily by the victory in Bakhmut. Again, quoted from a source in Medusa, nobody is going to touch the victorious Marshal of Bakhmut. But that is temporary. He is coming fresh off a victory, and so he's not going to be punished for the statements that he's made or the aggression that he has levied against major sources in the government and potentially against Putin. So Prigozhin is trying to move himself up in the Russian state and to move himself from the informal to the formal realm. But the problem, the big problem, is that his foundations in doing this are extremely shaky. This naturally makes it more difficult, but it is also why he has to try, because right now with those shaky foundations, a change in the political winds or a change of who's in power. And Putin is, maybe to some people in the regime, not looking the most stable right now. And even so, Prigozhin is younger than Putin. Putin will die eventually. Prigozhin does not want to be out in the cold when Putin is gone and the leadership changes over. And that right now is a serious danger that he could face. So ultimately, a big part of what I'm getting at here is that I think while Prigozhin is important, and he is there in such a way that everybody kind of has to deal with him and work with him or around him or against him, and that gives him a tremendous amount of, I guess, influence over the course of events and how other people act. He is, despite that, probably the major player in the weakest position, and I think a lot of people overvalue his capacity for influence, his capacity for violent change against the state, and the strength of his position. I think right now the people who are actually in the best position are the people who are already in the best position when the war started, and that is Sergei Shoigu, Nikolai Patrushev, and FSB chief Alexander Bortnikov. Now, a lot of people expected Shoigu's position to be dented by the bad outcome of the war, or if not dented, then completely destroyed with his removal from the Ministry of Defense. But obviously that doesn't happen. And would he be fired for incompetence and corruption and failure to build up a competent military? No, I don't think so. I think that that would be highly unlikely. We have also seen the FSB suffered a little bit during the early days of the war when it became clear that things were not going as promised, but no high-level figures like Bortnikov were touched. I believe the highest-ranking figure who was briefly prosecuted and reportedly held in Lefortovo prison, which is a major FSB prison, was Sergei Besezda, who headed the 9th Directorate of the FSB, which was responsible for intelligence gathering and operations in Russia's near abroad, which is the post-Soviet sphere, including Ukraine. But he was released from prison and restored to his position, and his son was shortly after promoted. So Shoigu and Bortnikov hold major positions within the two major instruments of state power, and they are both in Putin's high esteem. They have long histories with him. They have lots of connections within the government and within the power aspects of the government specifically. They're well connected. They have personal histories with Putin. They have strong, arguably the strongest positions within the government. And then there's Nikolai Patrushev. He is probably the closest person in the government to Putin and the most influential. They also have a very long history. They have personal connections. Patrushev used to head the FSB. He has connections within the FSB. He has connections within the military, within other ministries and arms of state power. He is very well connected. And while it doesn't give him any armed force, he is in a very important position. He's the Secretary of the Security Council. This is often brushed over, but before he was Prime Minister and shortly after he was FSB head, Putin was Secretary of the Security Council. Before becoming FSB head, he was Deputy Director of an FSB branch under Putin, but before that, he followed Putin to his administrative position in Moscow. When Putin was promoted, then Patrushev followed him to take over his old job. Same with the FSB. When Putin became Secretary of the Security Council, head of the Security Council, and then Prime Minister, Patrushev took over the FSB. And Putin became Prime Minister, became President, Patrushev took over the FSB, and eventually he was elevated to Secretary of the Security Council. So he has followed Putin's footsteps fairly closely, which, if you're looking for a sign of a likely successor, is one of the better, more interesting things that you can look at. Patrushev has been shown to have the enormous trust of the government. He's clashed with other old friends of Putin and come out on top. Viktor Cherkasov around 2007, 2008. Patrushev came out unscathed, more or less, and Cherkasov was removed from his position. So right now, the established regime elites very much have the upper hand and are in, by far, the strongest position. Prigozhin is significant, but he is an outsider, and his position is fairly weak. His options are limited. He is heavily dependent on people who don't like him very much and are only currently cooperating with him because of Putin and because of the war. So Shoigu and Gerasimov could cut him off from ammunition, as it's been suggested that they did to some degree earlier in the war. They could cut him off from transportation. Usually, PMCs do not require their own mass transportation, and even if they had it for their 10,000 mercenaries that they had before the war, Wagner has grown substantially. A lot of their forces are now made up of prison conscripts. How many of those are still alive and fighting condition is debatable. But there's a lot more people in Wagner than there were before the war, and that is one of the reasons it has grown so significant. And that means you need a lot more ammunition. You need a lot more food. You need to be able to move these people around in large numbers quickly. And to do that, Prigozhin relies on the Ministry of Defense. So he is incredibly vulnerable. He's on the outside. And above all, he's highly dependent on Putin's personal favor and Putin's requirement of him for the prosecuting of the war. And if those two things fade, then he is not in a good place. This has been a slightly rambling look at some of the dynamics in Russian politics right now, and thank you very much for listening.